YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Sunday the 6th of March 2016, getting ready for the Outsiders and First Dog on the Moon.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not. So true. This morning's guests, Vishal Kishore, Principal Fellow at the Melbourne School of Government, University of Melbourne, Katrina Sedgwick, Australian Centre for Moving Image Director and CEO, and Sinclair Davidson from the School of Economics at RMIT. And a week to conjure with, 20 years since the election of John Howard, a small reminder of what stability and self-confidence looked like. A week that saw American politics move closer to a clash between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, perhaps even a trash. A week that saw one somewhat unexpected issue raise its head, the Trump genitalia suddenly front of mind in American politics. Locally, there was a new book from journalist Nikki Sava, The Road to Ruin, How Tony Abbott and Peter Credlan Destroyed Their Own Government. Nikki on RM Breakfast with Fran tomorrow. Now, ladies, gentlemen, everyone is talking about a conversation reported in that book in which New South Wales Senator Conchetta Fierravanti-Wells asked Tony Abbott, Prime Minister, you and Peter, well, are you?
Had a conversation with Tony and had a conversation with Peter Credlan. I know that there are some articles that have been written today, including by Ms. Sava, quoting me, and I put certain comments on the record, and as quoted, they are correct.
Sinclair, the question was, Tony, you and Peter, everybody says you're having an affair. Leaving that aside for one moment, Tony just can't help but make himself the story right now, which perhaps is his intent.
Yes, I would have thought he's up to a bit of mischief making. And that's not such a bad thing after all. I think holding politicians off guard, off balance, is probably a good thing in the grand scheme of things. I just don't think that that's the job of government backbenchers to be doing that sort of thing.
That's to off-balance their own government.
Yes, yeah. Well, I don't know, his own government perhaps. But I think the more fascinating thing was when Mr. Abbott was rolled, he actually said, "We are not the Labor Party," and yet behaving in much the same way, I think, as a previous government did.
And there's this other issue in this, Katrina, too, that we can't have a man and a woman working in a powerful relationship and in a close working relationship without some sort of insinuation of sexual conduct.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite troubling because clearly there is a kind of codependency between these two, between the former Prime Minister and his Chief of Staff. And, it was dysfunctional, it was deeply problematic, but somehow, because it's a man and a woman, you just have to bring in this kind of layered gender sexual overtone, and that clouds everything still to this day.
And it explains nothing, and it is an unnecessary element in this conversation.
Yeah, I think it clutters and clouds, complex political issues, and it's a continuing issue we have with any kind of female within a political structure at the moment.
And Vishal, this is an interesting thing as we go on now with Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, and the contrast this week with the 20-year anniversary of John Howard is kind of stark, not for anything that Howard did, but for what didn't happen in that period, that it was stable, it was self-assured.
Look, I think that's absolutely right. And I think what we're seeing in the papers and in the press this week is really a battle to define the legacy of the Abbott government. And of course, a range of different players are interested in defining that. And it's a topic that Peter Van Onselen and Wayne Errigan have also recently talked about in one of their books, in a piece in the Griffith Review. But all governments, all organizations, all parties, they have multiple perspectives within them. The real question is, I think, how well can leadership bring an organization together around values and around purpose? And I think that this is what we're seeing now.
And those values have to be shared, though, don't they? And the problem here seems to be that the overwhelming value in politics is personal ambition. And that's not a thing that can be shared. That's a thing which comes from the self, and it's all about just building yourself up.
Well, it's quite interesting, particularly in the context of this week with the US elections looming heavily on our minds. During the Reagan period, and Jonathan, you're wearing a Reagan and Bush T-shirt today.
One of my favourites.
During the Reagan period, it was Reagan and the Republican Party captured the values ground in American politics. And they were the only people really talking about values. The Democrats were doing far less of that. And I think that the pathway for to bring a conservative set of perspectives together is really to go back to a more hopeful idea of values and a more hopeful idea of purpose, rather than dwelling too much in this kind of adversarial, perhaps individualistic, aggrandizing model.
I think that's where John Howard got it quite right, because he actually spoke about us being relaxed and comfortable. And I think we were relaxed and comfortable, whereas we don't have that right now. We have a very adversarial approach.
Except that Turnbull's pitch has been entirely on that sort of agenda. I mean, it's been about hope. It's been about a great time.
It has been, but the counterpoint to that, of course, is that people are now saying there's no real difference between Turnbull and Abbott. And of course, at one level, they're both Liberals. So we're not expecting there to be too much of a difference between them. But I don't think Mr. Turnbull has quite managed to get us into that relaxed and comfortable mode just yet, although that is certainly what he's aiming to do.
But isn't part of the problem that Turnbull, in terms of his own values, has had to set them aside in order to kind of deal with the deals he's had to make to get into that position?
And we've sensed that inconsistency about him.
Absolutely. And then I think the other thing about this week is that you see not just Howard, but Howard and Costello. And one of the big problems for this government has been that the kind of flawed relationship between the Prime Minister and Treasurer. You know, you've seen that with Abbott and Hockey, and perhaps certainly at the moment between Turnbull and Morrison.
The Liberals certainly haven't been able to produce another Costello. And I think Peter Costello is a remarkable individual. And we kind of got used to the idea of having such a talented person as Treasurer. And so when Lester...
Well, as we did with Hawke Keating as well, it's a fundamental relationship.
Yes. So we have Keating as Treasurer, we have Costello as Treasurer, and in between those two individuals and after them, we've had a group of people who are just not quite up to that same standard. And I think our expectations of what a Treasurer is Keating and Costello.
I wonder if there's something deeper in this too, Vishal, and this goes to... Trump represents this to some extent as well, is this fundamental schism at the moment in conservative politics between the hardline attitude often of the base of conservative parties and the electable centre of those parties that Turnbull represents in this country, that Abbott represents in this country, that the mainline GOP represents in America, that Trump represents. Is this a sort of a reconcilable thing? How does conservative politics pull this together?
I think there is an ongoing debate, exactly as you say, within conservative parties, but I'm not sure it has a huge amount to do with conservatism or conservative politics. So at the heart of conservatism is the basic idea that present value should be taken seriously and we shouldn't just sweep it aside even if good things are on the horizon for us. We should take that seriously. And I think what we're seeing out of, for example, particularly Trump, I mean, he's the archetype of this in a sense, is it's not conservative politics, it's the politics of anger and of estrangement. So he is riding a wave of community sentiment. It's a populist move. And it has relatively little to do with conservatism, which is a tragedy for conservatives, and that's why the Republican mainstream have such a problem with him. And I think that how that comes together, how you bring that together, because conservatism always does have this little, when it goes off, just like all political parties, they can be captured by the relative fringe, the relative fearful fringe. How you reconstruct, again, I think it's about values and purpose and a strength of leadership that appeals to those things rather than to the fear side of the battle.
It's that thing in politics, Katrina, isn't it, of a party trying to connect with a constituency. And this...
I read an interesting article in the SMH. Matthew McWilliams did a survey around kind of voter attitudes who are kind of pro-Trump at the moment. And they're saying the key issues are not race, age, income, church attendance, ideology, levels of education. It's around attitudes to authoritarianism, in that they want someone who is strong. And that's really interesting. It takes it almost out of ideology. And in fact, where you could argue that Trump is really flawed, in terms of his kind of flipping and flopping around kind of key issues. He absolutely contradicts himself in all sorts of areas of policy. And if you want some great illustration of that, go and watch John Oliver's takedown of him on this week tonight.
Definitely
Absolutely
worth searching out. Yes.
Hilarious. But, that contradictory approach to policy is actually seen as flexibility, and he's entertainment and he's strong, and that's what's getting him the kind of public support. So that puts kind of conservative politics in a really difficult position.
I mean, it's the thing that Sinclair that sort of Tony Abbott lacks, is it not? I mean, he might represent some of that body of sort of angry opinion in the base, and yet he doesn't have that sense of charisma and popularity.
No, I think Americans do over the top very well, which the rest of the world doesn't do quite as well. I mean, and Trump is, of course, over the top. He is flamboyant and narcissistic. The thing that gives me some hope, of course, is that the American Constitution is specifically designed to prevent people like Donald Trump from actually amassing too much power and doing too much damage, because the Americans revolted against good King George III and built into their constitutions all these checks and balances so that basically lunatics can't run the place.
It's a glimmer of hope.
I do, and of course I think the other thing we need to understand is that the words President Clinton are words that we understand and know already, and I think that will be the outcome of this.
That has the ring of inevitability about it. Outsiders, Sinclair Davidson, Katrina Sedgwick, and Vishal Kishore. Let's stick with America and Donald Trump for the moment, because this was the week that Donald Trump's penis became news.
He hit my hands. Nobody has ever hit my hands. I've never heard of this one. Look at those hands. Are they small hands? And he referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem. I guarantee.
Yeah. there is a long backstory here, but
do we want to know it?
Well, Donald Trump is referred to by Graydon Carter, the eminent editor, as a short-fingered vulgarian, and this was an insult hit at him by Marco Rubio, and Trump is now trying to say that, look, my hands are big and everything else is as well, and it's suddenly resonated with his base as well. Katrina,
it's disturbing.
We could do better than this, couldn't we?
We certainly can. And, it's really interesting. That just absolutely a verdict on the table kind of statement is so interesting when it looks like the two people who are going to be battling out this election are a woman running for the first ever female president against a man who we know is well hung.
In a conflict described by Huffington Post as a cockfight. So now we understand, and this Vishal is recent, is the men in Trump's crowds now are holding their hands up in a gesture that they too have large fingers.
Yeah, it's disturbing. I suspect the photos of that will start looking more and more like Hitler and less like an American election.
And without going to Godwin on this, I mean, it was an interesting thing. One of the things that went very viral on social media this week was a thing listed from the New York Times, its first mention of Hitler in the 1920s, I think, where the resonance to how a populist movement can arise with apparent innocence. And
I think this is where the authoritarianism comes in. I think Mr. Trump comes across as basically a fascist. He wants to round up millions of American citizens and deport them. He wants to build walls to keep people out. He wants to bring in 45% tariffs. He wants to create trade wars with the Japanese. I think certainly he's not going to be good news if he actually does or tries to do what he is kind of campaigning on. And I think electing angry people is a mistake. And I suspect what we will see is that, or I'm hoping, what we will see is that either the Republicans will roll him at the convention or he will lose at the November election.
Angry, Katrina, and yet charismatic and incredibly appealing. I mean, we cannot deny the groundswell of feeling that is coming behind.
Yeah, and I mean, Trump, values his own brand at $3 billion. I mean,
that's just the wonder of being me.
And in a country that is, absolutely about capitalism and the rise of the individual, that's incredibly potent and powerful. I think it's interesting about too what's happening with the voting, like in Super Tuesday. There was this sense that the Republican vote was very, very mobilised.
Okay, we're on the upload limit. Back with a new movie.